Hey, what's up everyone? It's Rosie here, and today we're diving into one of Skyrim's spookiest mysteries that for some reason has not been very thoroughly explored before. The origin and nature of the Reaper. This large specter can be encountered in the Soul Cairn once you reach the Beyond Death quest in the Dawnguard DLC. But who or what is this thing, and what purpose does it serve for the Ideal Masters? Well, I've investigated this more thoroughly than anyone has before, and I believe the Reaper has a secret identity. I actually originally intended for my findings here to be part of a package video covering 5 Skyrim mysteries like the one I did last year, but just like last time around, one of the mysteries ended up being a lot longer than the others, so we'll cover it now as its own video. So let's dive into the curious case of the Reaper. If you spend some time poking around the Soul Cairn, you may come across some little stones called Reaper Gem fragments. They can be found in chests near the giant rocks that absorb your health if you get too close. And the location you might find while exploring the Soul Cairn is this building called the Reaper's Lair. It's empty in here at first, but if you put all the Reaper Gem fragments in this obelisk here, then a boss fight will trigger. This large phantom called the Reaper will spawn in with a bunch of bowmen. He can spit poison at you, which is a reuse of the power the Afflicted use, Vile Vapor. When you kill him, he'll drop some empty black soul gems, a Daedra heart, and an iron battle axe. So who or what is this Reaper? There's clearly a lot of inspiration from the classic Grim Reaper, but what is this Reaper in regards to Elder Scrolls lore? Well, the item that really jumps off the page is the Daedra heart. The main place you find these is on the bodies of Daedra that you've slain, so this could suggest that the Reaper is a Daedra. However, killing the Reaper counts towards the Undead Killed stat in the Combat tab, not the Daedra Killed stat. I have seen conflicting accounts of this online, but in my tests on PC and console with and without mods, I've only ever seen the Reaper count towards Undead Killed, which is consistent with most creatures we encounter in the Soul Cairn. The general consensus among lore experts is that the creatures of the Soul Cairn, Bonemen, Wrathmen, Mistmen, and the Keepers, are not Daedra. These creatures are mysteries themselves, but one thing we know is that they're all counted as undead. And that seemingly means that they can't be Daedra, because Daedra have no dead or alive status, since they're not mortal. At least that's the consensus among experts. But then what's the Reaper doing with a Daedra heart? It seems rather clear that the dev would only put this here to hint something, but what? To answer that question, we need to know more about the Soul Cairn. This realm is featured in Skyrim, but it actually made its first appearance in the Elder Scrolls franchise all the way back in 1997 in an Elder Scrolls legend, Battlespire, which was originally meant to be an expansion for Daggerfall, but ended up becoming a spin-off type game where players proceeded through a sequence of, linear dungeons as opposed to the open world format that Bethesda was pioneering at the time. It took place during the 10 years known as the Imperial Simulacrum, which is the period of time that Uriel VII was imprisoned by Jaeger Farn. During Farn's reign, he made an alliance with Mehrunes Dagon, and part of the deal was that Dagon invaded some Oblivion realms, including the Soul Cairn. Fans would play as a character called the Apprentice, and their mission was to put a stop to Dagon's conquest. So, perhaps the Reaper was one of Dagon's soldiers, and he got soul-trapped during the invasion. There is a kind of Daedra that's known to serve Dagon that is right about the Reaper's size, Xivilai. These large muscular Daedra were heavily featured in Oblivion. But guess where the term Xivilai made its first appearance? An Elder Scrolls legend, Battlespire. Though the original idea was a bit different from what it's become. In Oblivion, Xivilai became a kind of Daedra. But back in Battlespire, it was the name of a clan of Daedra led by one of Mehrunes Dagon's adopted children, Xivilai Moath. And it was Moath that led the invasion of the Soul Cairn. He seems to have been intended as a unique creature at the time. As in, it doesn't seem like Bethesda intended Xivilai as a kind of Daedra like Hungers and Atronach's back in Battlespire. The term referred to Moath's clan, and its use in his name is, well, it's almost like how knights have the term Sir before their names, or like how some Eastern cultures place their surname first, which of course House Dagoth does in the games. But it seems that during Oblivion's development, they decided to make Xivilai a kind of Daedra, which was inspired by Moath's design in Battlespire. So with all that together, the modern canon as of Skyrim seems to entail that Moath was the only Xivilai, as in the kind of Daedra, that we can confirm was part of the force that invaded the Soul Cairn. So, could he somehow be the Reaper? Well, he is encountered after the Soul Cairn level of Battlespire in another realm. So if Moath made it out, then this can't be him, right? Well, maybe part of him didn't make it out. If we try to enter the Soul Cairn after choosing the Dawn Guard over the Volkihar clan, it won't work at first. Serana explains that it's trying to feed on our soul, and that it likely wouldn't do the same for vampires because they're undead. So she offers to turn us into a vampire. However, there is another option. She can also trap part of your soul in a gem and use that to pay the Ideal Masters for entry. To be clear, I don't think there's any sentient being that accepts these entry fees and allows people in. I think this is like an automated system. It's something the Ideal Masters set up when they created the Soul Cairn, but as a realm it just does this automatically. So if you go the Soul Trap route, that gem can later be retrieved in the Soul Cairn. And it's a Black Soul gem, much like the Reaper gem. So, maybe the Xivilai clan had to pay this entry fee as well when they entered the Soul Cairn. And the Reaper is the part of Moath's soul that got trapped, and likewise the Reaper gem is the gem it was trapped in. So there are some technicalities for us to think about here. First, would Daedra have to pay an entry fee? Well, I don't see why not. Based on Serana's dialogue, the rule seems to be that undead don't have to pay for entry, not that only mortals that are still alive do. And I don't think this is a question of, like, undead being given, like, a special privilege. I think this has to do with the functionality of the realm. The Soul Cairn is designed to house undead souls, so it can't feed on these souls because then they wouldn't be able to live in there. This is why I believe this entry process works like an automated system, because it explains this exception for undead. I think the reason that undead are not charged is because there's simply no way to charge them without causing a functional issue for the realm. So based on that, I think Daedra would have to pay the entry fee. But could Daedra use the vampire workaround? You may have seen me asking about this in subreddits a little while ago, and yeah, this is why. So the question here is, can Daedra be vampires? I'm honestly not sure at this point, but I'm leaning towards no. And even if they can, I think that most would avoid it because it would mean giving a specific prince authority over them, more like Baal. Which some Daedra would be okay with, but those that have pledged themselves to Dagon likely wouldn't be. So I'm inclined to think that Moath and his Xivilai clan did indeed pay the toll by doing the soul trap thing. It's also worth noting that Dremora can be soul trapped using black soul gems. So if there were Xivilai in Skyrim, I'm inclined to think they could be as well. After all, in Oblivion, they can be trapped in Grand Gems and Black Gems. So the Reaper being a soul-trapped part of Xivilai Moath is looking like a strong theory here. However, there is a noteworthy flaw. It doesn't really explain the Daedra heart. If this were part of Moath's soul that for whatever reason was freed from the gem, then theoretically it wouldn't have this. I mean, if the part of our soul that was trapped was let out of the gem and manifested as some sort of incorporeal form, we wouldn't expect it to have a human heart, would we? Our heart is still in our character. The split off part of the soul doesn't, like, grow a new one, right? So how does the Reaper have a Daedra heart? Regardless of whether our Moath theory is right or not, it still seems odd that it has one. I guess the lore-friendly explanation is it must have picked it up somewhere. Perhaps it looted it from some Daedra that traveled to the Soul Cairn. But the likely real reason that this Daedra heart is here is because the dev put it here to hint some sort of Daedra connection to us. However, I still take a bit of an issue with this notion because there are other ways the devs could have hinted that. They could have made the Reaper count towards the Daedra killed stat, and/or they could have given it a Daedric weapon instead of this Iron Battle Axe. But you know, I thought about it, and there are reasons why they might have leaned against those two methods in favor of the Daedra heart. First, if this is a vestige of Xivilai Moath, then why wouldn't it count toward Daedra killed? Well, these kinds of things tend to be more a question of functionality rather than of lore-oriented intent. But for argument's sake, let's assume there is some intent behind this. The likely reason would be that Bethesda decided undead is more consistent with what the Reaper is actually supposed to be. The souls in the Soul Cairn are those of people that were trapped in black soul gems, right? But if we were to kill one of them, we wouldn't expect that to count towards the people killed stat, would we? No, we'd expect that to count towards undead killed. So wouldn't the same thing apply to a Xivilai? Well, actually, maybe not. You see, Daedra souls just aren't the same as mortal souls. Also, I ran some tests, and I don't think there's a way to make a Daedra undead, at least not one that's accessible to us in the game. You see here that reanimated Dremora corpses don't count as undead. But once again, we shouldn't take this as fact because this is more a functional thing than a lore thing. But it certainly wouldn't hurt our case if we could confirm that there is a way to make a Daedra's corpse undead. But hold on a minute here, let's approach this from a different angle. The Reaper doesn't count toward Daedra killed, but what does it count as? Undead killed. So instead of asking why it doesn't count as a Daedra, let's ask why it does count as undead. Well, its species is skeleton, and its type is undead, just like bone men, mistmen, and wrathmen. So what exactly are these creatures? Well, the best source we have to go on for this is the Book of Life and Service, which lists ranks of something called the Blessed, and it includes those creatures. There's also something of note in here called the Bone Man's Oath, which seems to be a pact that souls make to serve the ideal masters in exchange for becoming bone men. So, it seems like the common kinds of undead we can find in the Soul Cairn are souls that for whatever reason swore themselves to serve the ideal masters, and these new forms were part of that bargain. And from other characters like Durnavir and Valerica, we know that the ideal masters are known to lure souls into becoming pawns for them with tricky bargains. Perhaps the Reaper is in that same situation. Maybe after Moath left the Soul Cairn without recovering his vestige, the Ideal Masters found the gem it resided in and agreed to let it out if it pledged itself into their service. Then it agreed and was made into the Reaper. Thus, it counts towards undead killed because it's essentially a bone man of Xivilai Moath. That adds up very nicely because 1, it explains the Reaper gem, it gives this thing a backstory, and 2, it also explains why it's now in fragments, because once the soul gets freed from a gem, or, it gets used, it falls apart. So that's what I'm going with for the lore-friendly explanation as to why the Reaper counts as undead rather than Daedra. Additionally, based on this notion with this Oath of Service to the Ideal Masters, I think I may know what the Reaper's purpose is to them. Let's think about the circumstances of this bargain for a minute. From Serana's dialogue, we can gather that the humanoid souls inhabiting the Soul Cairn are people that were trapped in black soul gems and were sent here once their gem was used. So they don't go here upon being trapped in the gem, they're literally in the gem at that point. They get sent here when someone uses the gem for something like enchanting. So, let me ask you something. If you were trapped in one of these indefinitely, until someone uses the gem, but then the Ideal Masters offered to let you out in exchange for serving them in some way, would you take the deal? Maybe, but you might hold out for a while at first. Because you might feel comfortable betting on that whoever soul trapped you intends to use the gem, or is going to sell it to someone who will use the gem. However, what if you weren't soul trapped just anywhere, but you were forced into the gem within the Soul Cairn itself? In that case, you'd be much more inclined to take the deal, because how likely is it that someone who's even capable of enchanting is going to happen by, find your gem, and use it? That could be a very, very long wait, if ever. And going along with our Moath theory, that's the situation the vestige that became the Reaper would have been in as well. Since our vestige is sent to some random place in the Soul Cairn if that's how we choose to pay for entry, it stands to reason that the same thing would have happened with Moaths. So what does all this have to do with the Reaper's role to the Ideal Masters? Well, if you're paying attention, some of the souls in the Soul Cairn will sometimes say, "Shh, he's watching us." At first I had disregarded this because I was thinking, well, they could just as easily be talking about Durnavir, but I don't believe they are. I think they are indeed referring to the Reaper, and here's why. Remember when we looked at his inventory? He had some empty black soul gems. So, I believe the role the Reaper serves to the Ideal Masters, his job if you will, is to roam the Soul Cairn trapping these souls in black gems. So that there will always be a steady supply of souls that will be inclined to pledge themselves to the Ideal Masters in exchange for freedom from their gem. Thus, where most Wrathmen, Mistmen, and Bone Men likely come from. They're souls that were so unlucky that they got trapped in black gems twice in their existence. This is also very fitting because it's kind of like the Grim Reaper's job in folklore, he gathers souls. So yeah, that's what I think the service the Reaper does for the Ideal Masters is. But assuming all that we put together so far is right, why not give the Reaper a Daedric weapon to hint its Daedric origin in place of the heart? Well, I put a lot of digging into this, and I actually think Bethesda originally intended to give the Reaper a unique weapon, but ended up having to make a compromise there. I'm actually fairly confident that a lot of plans for the Dawnguard DLC were cut for various reasons, including time constraints. This is something I may cover in more detail in the future, but I guess what I'll say for now is, well, here's an example. I believe they intended to do a lot more with the areas hidden inside Fort Dawnguard than they did, like Dead Drop Falls it's called. I think they meant to do more back there. Back on subject, as I was researching for this video, it occurred to me that it's odd that Bethesda didn't bother to put a single unique weapon in the Soul Cairn. It seems a very obvious place to do something like that, yet nothing. And after thinking about it some more, I realized that the glaringly obvious place to put one would be the Reaper objective. It's this epic boss battle that you have to do some exploring to find, yet there's not much of a reward for it. So maybe there was originally supposed to be something more to be gained from this. The character is clearly part inspired by Western folklore's Grim Reaper, who's known to carry a scythe. So could it be that Bethesda wanted to give the Reaper a scythe and that would have been our reward? After all, the Iron Battle Axe definitely looks the most scythe-ish of all the weapons in Skyrim, so maybe they picked it because they ran out of time to finish what would have been a scythe model, so they just picked the thing that looks the most like it. However, there could be another reason why this was cut besides time constraints. This is something that I had actually cut from the original script, but when I realized this was going to become its own video, I added it back in. There's this item that seems to have been added to the game files with Dawnguard called the Test Vorpal Sword. It uses the ebony blade as its base model, and it does an obscene amount of damage, enough to instant kill any enemy. So from the name, we know that its purpose is to test something, but what? Based on the absurd amount of damage it does, the common theory is that it's for testing kill moves on the enemies that Dawnguard added. Which could be true, however, there is something that makes me a little skeptical of that. If it is indeed for testing kill moves on new NPC models, then why isn't there a one-handed version of it? It's not very thorough to just test them with a two-handed weapon. So what else could you test with this? Well, sometimes before unique items are finished, devs will add their unique effects to, random items just to test them. It makes it so you don't have to wait for the models to be finished to test, like damage calculations and all that stuff. So, could the Test Vorpal Sword be a prototype for the Grim Reaper Scythe? Well, I certainly don't think their plan was to give us, the players, an item that's an instant kill for any enemy. But I do think it might be for testing their original plan for the Reaper boss fight. So what am I talking about here? Well, I kept thinking, why so much damage? What would that be to test? Then it occurred to me that the Grim Reaper's little gimmick is that when he touches you, you die. So I think it's possible that Bethesda's original vision for the Reaper boss fight was that we would have to dodge every single strike because one strike is a KO. So they made this Test Vorpal Sword to see if something like that would work, and ultimately decided it was too hard, and that's how we ended up with the Reaper boss fight that's in the game. After all, they did really try to push the needle with what they could do with boss fights in this DLC. There's the Durnavir fight, all the Ice Falmer with Verfer, and Harkon, of course. So I really don't think it's out of the question that at some point they had an idea for a boss fight where we would have had to dodge every single blow. To be clear, this theory is not that the Test Vorpal Sword is a prototype for the Scythe, it's that it's a way that they could test what they originally wanted to do with the boss fight as a whole. And even so, I'm not sold on it. I think it is equally as likely that it is for testing kill moves or something else that requires a huge amount of damage. I threw it in here so that you can decide what you think about it for yourself. So in summary, Bethesda was probably pressed for time near the end of Dawnguard's development, and decisions needed to be made quickly. So during all that haste, they ended up giving the Reaper the most scythe-ish weapon they had, and placing the Daedra Heart in its inventory to establish the Daedra connection. Overall, not an ironclad theory, but yeah, I believe this vestige of Xivilai Moath theory we've established is right. It's absolutely the kind of thing the devs I know and love would go for. I mean, we know that we are in the Battlespire throwback, we are in the Soul Cairn. And Moath is exactly the kind of character they would look to do something like this with. Also, there's one last detail that was really the tip of the iceberg for me, the thing that really convinced me that this is right. The Xivilai that we know from more recent games than Battlespire, like Oblivion and DSO, have yellow eyes. But Moath, the OG Xivilai, had red eyes. And guess what color the Reaper's eyes are? They're glowing red, just like Moath's. That last subtle detail is really what tipped me onto this side of the fence. To summarize it all, I believe that the Reaper is the part of Xivilai Moath's soul that he used to pay for entry into the Soul Cairn when he invaded this realm during the Imperial Simulacrum. The Ideal Masters agreed to let it out of what's now the Reaper gem if it swore itself into their service, just like Bone Men, Mistmen, and Wrathmen do. And this service that the Reaper does for the Ideal Masters is collecting souls within the Soul Cairn itself so that there's always a steady supply of those other creatures. And that's a wrap, folks. The next video with the package of 5 Skyrim mysteries shouldn't be a long wait because it's written, I just need to record, film, and edit it. Also, a bit of an announcement here, I will be attending this year's Fallout fan celebration in Good Springs, Nevada. And in spirit of that, the next video after that one will likely be a package of Fallout New Vegas mysteries, so if there are any particular mysteries you want me to cover from that game, then please be sure to let me know in the comments. I highly recommend going to this. I've heard it's a lot of fun, and I hope to see a lot of you there. Thank you all so much for watching. Please be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with all your Skyrim-loving friends. It all helps me out a whole lot, and I will see you next time.